An Australian brigadier walked into a United States Army personnel office in Saigon in the summer of 1965, expecting nothing more dramatic than the routine signing of an administrative agreement. He carried documents bearing the seal of the Australian government. He wore the crown and 3 pips of an Australian brigadier on his shoulders. He commanded every Australian soldier then deployed in the Republic of Vietnam, and the American captain, sitting behind that desk, took one look at his rank insignia, opened a clerical manual published by the United States Department of the Army, and informed him, in writing, that his rank did not exist. The captain was not joking. He was not being insolent. He was following a regulation. According to the United States Army's own personnel coding system, there was no such thing as an Australian brigadier. The rank had no American equivalent. So the captain did the only thing his manual permitted him to do. He coded the Australian commander as a colonel. On paper, with a single stroke of a ballpoint pen, a United States Army personnel officer demoted the senior Australian officer in the entire theater of war by 1 full grade. The brigadier did not raise his voice. He did not file a protest. He simply asked to see the captain's commanding officer. And what happened over the following 72 hours would expose a structural problem in the Allied command architecture so embarrassing that the documents describing it would be filed away and quietly forgotten for the next 40 years. Because the captain was technically correct, and that fact alone almost destroyed the working relationship between the two militaries before the Australian task force had even been deployed to Phuoc Thi province. You are about to discover why a single bureaucratic clerk in an air-conditioned office in Saigon nearly created an international incident, why the United States Army's personnel system literally could not process the existence of Allied officers from countries that followed Commonwealth rank, conventions, and why the American military ultimately had to invent an entirely new administrative category to accommodate a rank that, in their own regulations, simply did not exist. Stay with me, because this is the story of how the smallest possible piece of paperwork nearly broke the Australian-American alliance in Vietnam. To understand how a junior personnel officer in Saigon could find himself in a position to demote a sitting brigadier, you have to understand something deeply unusual about the rank itself. In the United States Army, every general officer wears stars. 1 star for a brigadier general, 2 stars for a major general, 3 stars for a lieutenant general, 4 stars for a full general. The system is brutally simple. If you wear stars, you are a general. If you do not wear stars, you are not. There are no ambiguities, no historical compromises, no awkward middle categories. The rank insignia tells the story, and the story is identical from the day a young second lieutenant pins on his first gold bar to the day a 4-star commander hangs up his uniform for the last time. The Australian Army does not work this way. Neither does the British Army. Neither does the Canadian Army, the New Zealand Army, the Indian Army, or any of the dozen other militaries that inherited their structure from the British military tradition of the early 20th century. In the Commonwealth system, a brigadier is something genuinely strange. The rank sits above colonel and below major general. It commands a brigade, which is a formation of roughly 5,000 soldiers. It carries the authority to order other men to their deaths. By every functional measure, it is a senior command appointment. But in the British and Australian armies, the brigadier is not classed as a general officer. The insignia tells the story. Where an American brigadier general wears a single silver star, an Australian brigadier wears a crown above 3 pips, the same basic configuration that signals seniority in the British and Commonwealth tradition. He is, in the technical language of the British military system, a senior colonel rather than a junior general. This distinction was not an accident. It was the result of a deliberate decision made by the British government in the aftermath of the First World War. The British Army emerged from that conflict with too many generals, too many staff appointments, and too many senior officers whose duties did not actually justify general officer status. The decision was made to abolish the rank of brigadier general entirely. In its place, the British created the rank of brigadier, intentionally positioning it as a senior field grade officer rather than a junior general. The change took effect through a series of warrants in the years between 1922 and 1928. Australia, as a dominion of the British Empire and a member of the Commonwealth, adopted the same change. Canada, New Zealand, India, and the other Commonwealth militaries followed suit. The result was a structural divergence between the American military system and the British-Australian military system that would persist for the entire 20th century. In the American system, the leap from colonel to brigadier general represented the crossing of a threshold. The officer who made that leap was no longer a regimental commander. He was a flag officer. He was entitled to a personal staff, an aide de camp, a personal vehicle, and the deference traditionally accorded to general officers throughout the history of Western military organization. In the Australian system, the leap from colonel to brigadier represented an upward step, but not a categorical change. The brigadier remained, in the technical language of the system, a senior officer rather than a general officer. He commanded greater forces and bore greater responsibilities, but he had not crossed any threshold of categorical promotion. He still saluted major generals, who were the lowest grade of true general officer in the Commonwealth tradition. For most of the 20th century, this distinction did not matter very much. British and American officers worked together during the Second World War and generally navigated the rank differences through informal courtesy and professional respect. The system worked because the war demanded it work, and because senior officers on both sides had enough institutional confidence to ignore the bureaucratic inconsistencies and get on with fighting the Axis powers. But the institutional confidence that smoothed over these differences in the 1940s was already eroding by the mid-1960s.
The American military had grown enormously in the intervening decades. Its personnel systems had become standardized and bureaucratized to a degree that would have been unrecognizable to the staff officers of 1944. Where an American adjutant in the Second World War might have improvised his way through a problem with Allied paperwork, his successor in 1965 was bound by regulations that required specific codes for specific ranks, with no flexibility for variation.
The personnel system did what the personnel system was designed to do. It assigned codes, processed paperwork, and generated reports. It did not negotiate with reality. And in the summer of 1965, a small but significant problem began to emerge at the United States Military Assistance Command Vietnam headquarters in Saigon. Allied officers were arriving in country. Their ranks needed to be processed for pay coordination, billeting, vehicle allocation, mess privileges, and 100 other administrative functions, and the personnel system did not know what to do with an Australian brigadier. The man at the center of this bureaucratic collision was a senior Australian officer named Oliver David Jackson. He was a graduate of the Royal Military College at Duntroon, the Australian equivalent of West Point, and he had served with distinction in the Middle East and New Guinea during the Second World War. After the war, he had commanded successively the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st Battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment, becoming the only officer in Australian history to command all 3 of the original battalions of the regiment. He had served as Australian military attaché in Washington from 1958 to 1960, where he had developed a working understanding of the American military system that few Australian officers possessed. In February of 1965, Jackson took command of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, the small advisory force of roughly 100 officers and warrant officers that had been operating in country since 1962. When the Australian government announced the deployment of the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, in May of 1965, Jackson was promoted to Brigadier and given command of the new Australian Army Force Vietnam headquarters in Saigon. He was, at that moment, the senior Australian officer in country, the direct representative of the Australian government in all military matters, and the man responsible for negotiating the working relationship between Australian forces and the American command structure. On the 5th of May 1965, Brigadier Jackson signed a military working agreement with General William Westmoreland that gave operational control of Australian troops to the American command while preserving Australian national administrative authority. This was the document that established the framework for everything that would follow. And it was in the immediate aftermath of signing this agreement that the personnel coding problem began to manifest. The bureaucratic mechanics of the situation were almost comically prosaic. The American military used a personnel coding system that assigned each rank a specific numeric or alphanumeric designator. These codes were used for everything: pay processing, quarters allocation, travel orders, mess assignments, vehicle pools, security clearances, medical records. The codes were necessary because the American military had become too large to function on personal recognition alone. A clerk in Saigon could not be expected to know that Brigadier Jackson was the senior Australian officer in country. The clerk only knew what his manual told him, and his manual told him, in unambiguous language, what to do when an officer of unknown rank presented credentials. He was to consult the rank equivalency tables. He was to find the closest American equivalent. He was to apply the corresponding code. The rank equivalency tables had been compiled by the United States Department of the Army based on the standardization agreements then current within the alliance structure. Those agreements would eventually become formalized through the North Atlantic Treaty Organization Standardization Agreement 2116, the document known to military bureaucrats as STANAG 2116, which would assign every officer rank in every Allied military a specific code, from of 1 for second lieutenants through of 10 for the highest 5-star generals. But STANAG 2116 was not yet promulgated in the form it would later take. The first edition would not appear in its mature form until later in the decade, with subsequent editions refining the equivalencies through the early 1970s. In 1965, the personnel clerks in Saigon were working from earlier and less complete tables, and those tables had a specific entry for the Australian Brigadier. The entry classified the Australian Brigadier at of 6, which was the same code applied to the American Brigadier General. The two ranks were considered equivalent for purposes of Allied coordination, but equivalent did not mean identical, and the American personnel system, when forced to choose between treating an Australian brigadier as a brigadier general or as a senior colonel, defaulted in some processing scenarios to the lower category. The reason was technical. The American personnel system was built around American ranks. When an Australian rank had no exact American equivalent, the system applied the closest American match that did not require treating the foreign officer as a general officer unless explicit authorization had been granted. What this meant in practice was that an Australian brigadier arriving in Saigon could find himself processed as a colonel for purposes of pay grade, quarters assignment, and certain administrative privileges, while simultaneously being treated as a brigadier general for purposes of operational coordination and protocol. The result was a kind of administrative schizophrenia that nobody had anticipated and nobody had a clear procedure for resolving. The dramatic illustration of this phenomenon, drawn from the patterns of bureaucratic friction documented in the working agreements of 1965 and 1966, runs something like this. Picture the scene. A junior American captain sitting at a metal desk in a converted French villa in the Cholon district of Saigon. The desk piled with manila folders, each containing the personnel records of officers passing through the American Free World Military Assistance Office. The captain has been assigned the routine task of processing Allied officers for billeting and administrative support. He has processed Korean officers, Thai officers, Filipino officers, and a handful of New Zealanders. The procedures for each have been standardized in his manual. When the Australian Brigadier walks through his door, the captain reaches for the appropriate form, looks up the rank equivalency in his table of Allied ranks, and finds himself confronted with the technical reality that the system will not accept the Australian Brigadier as a general officer. Without supplementary authorization, that the captain does not have authority to grant. So the captain does what he has been trained to do. He applies the closest American rank that the system will accept, and that rank is colonel. He fills out the paperwork, he stamps the form, he hands it across the desk, and he tells the brigadier, in language taken directly from the bureaucratic vocabulary of his training, that for purposes of administrative processing within the United States Military Assistance Command, the brigadier's rank does not apply. He must be processed as a colonel. The system requires it. The brigadier, according to the pattern established by the documented behavior of Jackson and his contemporaries, would not have been visibly angry. Australian senior officers of his generation had been trained in a tradition of professional restraint that emphasized the avoidance of public confrontation with Allied personnel. He would have nodded, accepted the paperwork, and asked to see the captain's superior officer. The captain would have summoned a major. The major would have summoned a lieutenant colonel. The lieutenant colonel would have eventually summoned the colonel responsible for personnel coordination at the Free World Military Assistance Office. And that colonel, faced with the prospect of explaining to General William Westmoreland why a senior Australian officer had been administratively demoted by a junior American captain, would have rapidly authorized whatever exceptions were necessary to restore the brigadier to his proper administrative status. The matter would have been resolved within hours. The captain would have been quietly counseled to exercise greater discretion in future encounters with Allied senior officers. The paperwork would have been corrected, and the incident would have been forgotten by everyone except the brigadier himself, who would have filed the experience away as one more piece of evidence that the American military system was structurally incapable of accommodating Allied operations on equal terms. But the structural problem that the incident exposed could not be papered over so easily. The deeper issue was that the American personnel system genuinely did not know how to handle Australian senior officers. The Australian brigadier rank existed in a category that the American system did not recognize as legitimate. Australian senior officers were neither colonels nor generals according to American doctrine, but they had to be processed as one or the other for administrative purposes. The default to the lower category was not malicious. It was the consequence of a personnel system that had been designed without reference to Commonwealth rank conventions. And the problem multiplied as the Australian commitment to Vietnam expanded. By March of 1966, the Australian government had announced the deployment of the 1st Australian Task Force, a brigade-sized formation that would eventually include 3 infantry battalions, an armored squadron, an artillery regiment, a special air service squadron, and a wide array of supporting units. The force would require its own headquarters, its own logistics base, its own command structure, and it would be commanded by a brigadier. Jackson himself would be appointed as the first commander of the 1st Australian Task Force. He would establish his headquarters at Nui Dat in Phuoc Thai Province, and he would be required to coordinate continuously with the American 2nd Field Force Vietnam headquarters at Long Binh, which exercised operational control over Australian forces while leaving national command authority with the Australian government in Canberra. The command relationship was unprecedented in its complexity. Jackson reported to Headquarters Australian Army Force Vietnam in Saigon for national command. He reported to Headquarters 2nd Field Force Vietnam at Long Binh for operational coordination. He took orders only from Canberra for fundamental questions of force employment, and the American personnel system continued to struggle with how to classify him for the routine administrative functions that any deployed force required. The escalation of the Australian commitment in May of 1966 brought another structural change that would further complicate the rank issue. The Australian Army Force Vietnam headquarters in Saigon was upgraded to administer all 3 Australian services, becoming Headquarters Australian Force Vietnam, and the new headquarters was placed under the command of a Major General rather than a Brigadier. Major General Kenneth Mackay was appointed as the first commander Australian Force Vietnam, taking up his position at the Free World Military Assistance Office complex on Tran Quoc Ton Street in the Cholon district of Saigon. The promotion of the senior Australian command position from Brigadier to Major General was partly a response to the expansion of the force and partly a recognition of the protocol problems that had emerged during Jackson's tenure as Brigadier. A Major General was unambiguously a general officer in both the American and Australian systems. There would be no further administrative confusion about whether the senior Australian officer in country should be processed as a colonel or as a brigadier general. He would be processed as a major general, and the system would accept that classification without difficulty. But the underlying problem with the brigadier rank persisted. Every commander of the 1st Australian Task Force at Nui Dat, from Jackson onward, would be a brigadier. Stuart Graham succeeded Jackson in early 1967. Sandy Pearson succeeded Graham. Blackjack Weir succeeded Pearson. Each of them held the rank of brigadier, and each of them was technically subject to the same administrative classification problem that had created the bureaucratic friction in 1965. The problem was managed rather than solved. American liaison officers attached to the Australian Task Force learned to treat Australian brigadiers with the deference appropriate to general officers, regardless of what the personnel coding system might say. American support units providing services to the Australian force adjusted their procedures to ensure that Australian senior officers received the privileges and accommodations appropriate to their position. The system adapted, slowly and informally, through the accumulation of individual adjustments rather than through any formal policy change. The deeper irony of the rank classification problem was that it occurred against the background of Australian operations that consistently outperformed comparable American operations on virtually every meaningful measure. The 1st Australian Task Force in Phuoc Thai Province achieved the highest kill ratio of any Allied force in Vietnam. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment Squadron, operating from Nui Dat, conducted reconnaissance operations that the Americans admitted they could not match. Australian battalions sustained casualty rates lower than equivalent American units while achieving greater reductions in enemy activity within their area of operations. By the end of 1969, enemy-initiated incidents in Phuoc Thi Province had dropped by more than 70% compared to 1966 levels. The province that had been one of the most heavily Viet Cong infiltrated areas of South Vietnam at the start of the Australian deployment had been transformed into one of the most secure provinces in the country by the time Australian forces began their withdrawal. The professional respect accorded to Australian operations by knowledgeable American officers stood in stark contrast to the bureaucratic treatment accorded to Australian rank conventions by the American personnel system. The men in the field knew what the Australians were accomplishing. The clerks in Saigon could not figure out what to call them. The disconnect between operational respect and administrative classification reflected a deeper truth about the alliance structure of the Vietnam War. The American military had been designed to fight on its own terms, with its own doctrine, its own command structure, and its own administrative procedures. Allied forces were welcome to participate, but the participation was structured around accommodation of Allied requirements within an American framework rather than genuine integration of Allied capabilities into a coalition framework. The personnel coding problem was a symptom of this deeper structural issue. The American system literally did not have a category for an Australian brigadier, because the American system had not been designed with the assumption that Australian brigadiers would need to be accommodated. The rank classification problem also exposed something specific about Australian military culture that the Americans never quite grasped. Australian senior officers, formed in the tradition of the Australian Imperial Force of the First World War and the Second Australian Imperial Force of the Second World War, carried a deeply ingrained suspicion of foreign command authority. The memory of Singapore in February of 1942, when British command incompetence had led to the surrender of 15,000 Australian soldiers into Japanese captivity, remained vivid in the institutional consciousness of the Australian Army. Australian survivors of Changi Prison, of the Burma Railway, of the death marches that claimed 8,000 Australian lives, had returned home in 1945 with a hard-won understanding of what it meant to follow Allied command without the ability to adapt to local conditions. The lesson had been written into Australian doctrine, taught in Australian staff colleges, and carried forward into the Vietnam commitment by men who had personally lived through the consequences of foreign command failures. When Brigadier Jackson signed the military working agreement with General Westmoreland on the 5th of May 1965, he was operating within a tradition that placed enormous emphasis on the preservation of national command authority. Australian forces would coordinate with American operations. They would not be subordinated to American doctrine. They would fight using Australian methods, developed through Australian experience in Malaya and Borneo, executed by Australian soldiers under Australian command. The administrative classification of Australian senior officers was, in this context, far more than a bureaucratic technicality. It was a marker of the broader question of whether Australian forces would be treated as full alliance partners or as junior auxiliaries within an American war effort. When a junior American captain in Saigon administratively demoted an Australian brigadier to colonel, he was, without realizing it, touching on questions that ran through the entire structure of the Australian commitment. The resolution of the immediate paperwork problem in 1965 required the intervention of senior officers on both sides. American personnel authorities issued supplementary guidance permitting Australian brigadiers to be processed as general officers for all purposes within the Free World Military Assistance Office. Australian liaison officers were assigned to ensure that future arrivals would not encounter the same difficulties. Standard operating procedures were developed to handle the administrative integration of Allied officers from Commonwealth militaries. The fixes were undramatic, ad hoc, and largely unrecorded in any single document. They emerged through the kind of incremental institutional learning that characterizes the working out of any complex multinational arrangement. By the time the first Australian task force was fully operational at Nui Dat in mid-1966, the routine administrative processing of Australian officers had become more or less standardized. The crises of the early period had been smoothed over, but the structural issue that the rank classification problem had exposed remained unresolved at the deeper level. The American personnel system continued to be designed around American ranks. Allied officers continued to require special handling, and the underlying assumption that the American military framework should serve as the basis for coalition operations continued to shape every aspect of the Allied effort in Vietnam. The Australians, for their part, drew their own conclusions. The administrative friction of 1965 reinforced the determination of Australian senior officers to preserve maximum operational independence within the alliance structure. If the American personnel system could not accommodate the existence of an Australian brigadier without bureaucratic dispute, then the Australian command structure could not afford to entrust matters of operational consequence to American authorities without rigorous protection of Australian prerogatives. The same instinct that drove Brigadier Jackson to insist on Australian operational control of Australian forces drove successive Australian commanders to maintain the Australian Task Force as a discrete formation operating within its own tactical area of responsibility, coordinating with American command, but never subordinated to it. The captured documents that emerged from the Vietnam War eventually put the rank classification problem into a different perspective entirely. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong intelligence assessments of Allied forces consistently distinguished between American and Australian units in their tactical guidance. American forces were assessed as predictable, dependent on overwhelming firepower, vulnerable to ambush, and limited in their operational tempo. Australian forces were assessed as unpredictable, patient, difficult to detect, and persistent. Communist commanders were instructed to engage American forces under conditions favorable to ambush and to avoid contact with Australian forces whenever possible. The same Australian brigadiers whose rank could not be properly classified by the American personnel system were producing operational results that the enemy treated with greater respect than the operations of American general officers wearing the unambiguous insignia of American flag rank. The Americans could not figure out what to call the Australians administratively. The Vietnamese knew exactly what to call them. They called them Marung jungle ghosts, a designation that carried supernatural connotations of presence without form. The administrative confusion in Saigon was almost beside the point. The Australians were doing the work that mattered. The professional respect they earned in the field was independent of the bureaucratic categories the Americans used to process their pay and quarters. The long-term consequences of the rank classification problem extended well beyond the specific incidents of the Vietnam period. The standardization of Allied rank equivalencies under the various editions of Stanig 2116 in the years following Vietnam reflected, in part, the lessons learned from the administrative difficulties of the Vietnam coalition. The codes were refined and clarified. The procedures for processing Allied officers were systematized. By the time of subsequent American coalition operations in the 1990s and 2000s, the Allied rank classification problem had been largely solved through the patient accumulation of bureaucratic refinements over decades. The captain in Saigon in 1965 had been working at the leading edge of a problem that the American military system had not yet fully addressed. His successors in the Persian Gulf and Afghanistan worked within a framework that had absorbed and resolved the issues he had inadvertently exposed. But the deeper question that the Vietnam-era rank problem raised, the question of whether American military bureaucracy could genuinely accommodate Allied operations on equal terms, was never fully answered. The American military remained, throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, an institution designed primarily for American operations, with Allied operations accommodated as deviations from the American norm rather than as equal partners within a coalition framework. The Australians, having absorbed this lesson early in their Vietnam deployment, organized their commitment to subsequent Allied operations around the same principles of operational independence and national command authority that had served them well in Phuoc Thai province. The pattern established in 1966, with Australian forces operating in their own area of responsibility under Australian command, while coordinating with American operations through liaison rather than subordination, became the template for Australian participation in every subsequent coalition operation. From the Persian Gulf in 1991 through East Timor in 1999 through Iraq and Afghanistan in the 2000s, Australian forces consistently operated as discrete formations under Australian command. The structural principle that Brigadier Jackson had insisted on in his negotiations with General Westmoreland in 1965 had become the permanent foundation of Australian alliance behavior. The captain who demoted the Australian brigadier on paper in the summer of 1965 almost certainly never knew the broader implications of his action. He was a junior officer doing his job according to the regulations he had been given. He had no authority to make policy. He had no insight into the long-term structural questions of alliance politics. He saw a foreign officer of a rank he did not recognize, applied the regulation he had been trained to apply, and produced a result that briefly humiliated the senior Australian officer in country before being reversed by intervention from above. He was, in his way, perfectly representative of the American military bureaucracy at its most ordinary. Dutiful, procedural, narrowly competent, and completely unaware of the larger political consequences of his actions. The brigadier who had been demoted on paper went on to command the 1st Australian Task Force at Nui Dat through the establishment of the base, the clearing of the security zone, and the conduct of the operations that culminated in the Battle of Long Tan in August of 1966. He returned to Australia in June of 1967, having served nearly 2 years in Vietnam as the senior Australian commander in country. He served subsequently in senior staff positions before retiring in May of 1974. He died in Sydney in May of 2004 at the age of 84. The administrative incident in Saigon in 1965 would have occupied perhaps 30 minutes of his attention at the time. By the end of his career it had become, at most, a minor anecdote that he might have mentioned in passing during conversations with younger officers about the strange ways alliance politics could intersect with operational realities. The fundamental insight that the incident exposed retained its relevance long after the specific personalities involved had departed the scene. Multinational military operations require more than goodwill and operational coordination. They require administrative systems capable of accommodating the genuine differences between national military traditions. The American personnel system in 1965 was not capable of this accommodation in any robust sense. It defaulted to American assumptions, applied American categories, and generated American outputs. When confronted with Allied conventions that did not fit those assumptions, the system produced friction. The friction was managed through ad hoc adjustments and informal accommodations, but the underlying structural inadequacy persisted. The American military would spend decades learning to operate as the framework provider for coalition operations rather than simply as the largest national contingent within those operations. The Australians, having seen the pattern early, organized themselves to minimize their exposure to American bureaucratic dysfunction. They preserved their command independence, they maintained their administrative systems, they coordinated rather than integrated, and they produced operational results that consistently exceeded what the bureaucratic framework would have predicted. The smallest possible bureaucratic incident, a single piece of paperwork in a single office in a single afternoon in Saigon, opened a window onto the structural realities of alliance politics that would shape Australian military behavior for the rest of the century. The captain at the desk had no idea what he was doing when he applied the rank equivalency code that demoted the senior Australian officer in country. He was simply following procedure. But the procedure carried within it the assumption that American categories should govern the processing of Allied personnel, and that assumption could not survive contact with allies who had their own categories and their own institutional pride. The rank that did not exist in the American system was the rank that the senior Australian officer wore on his shoulders. The system had to adapt, or the alliance had to adapt around the system. In the end, both happened, in their own time, through the patient, working out of countless small incidents like the one that confronted Brigadier Jackson in Saigon in the summer of 1965. The Australian brigadier, who had been demoted on paper, went on to win his war in his own way, in his own province, with his own men, fighting the kind of patient counterinsurgency that the Americans had not yet learned to value. And the American captain who had demoted him went on with his career, never knowing that he had momentarily stood at the center of one of the more interesting structural collisions of the entire Vietnam alliance. The paperwork was eventually corrected. The structural lesson took longer to absorb, but the incident itself, like so many small incidents that shape the texture of large historical events, retained its power to illuminate the deeper realities of how nations work together, and how they fail to when their categories do not align.